Welcome, folks. Again, sales associates, budding sales professionals, and those looking obviously to not just create a foothold into the market, but to move into a space where we're talking today, session 8, about a subject that to me is, well, I'd have to say is rather revolutionary inside the real estate prospecting space. And that, of course, is the third of what we call the big 3 prospect generators. And that, of course, is leverage, or the process that by which we name that the regenerative prospecting process. Now, many salespeople will tell you, and even some of you would have already had this experience of understanding that, listings beget listings. And certainly I talked about this in the early stages, or I do talk about this in terms of, presence. The reality is that the number one draw card in any marketplace is presence in that marketplace. And there's no better form of presence, of course, than the signboards that you have up. And if you've got signboards up, you made a consideration. And as long as when you go down to do that listing presentation, when you open your mouth, what comes out of it, or what for the words that fall out, don't constitute you being, they don't constitute that of you being an idiot, that you actually know what you're talking about, you've every chance of winning the listing. But leverage is something that is just not really understood inside the process. I mean, I would concede that most agents wrongly assume that the number one draw card in this day and age is having online presence. I'm not saying that that's not a good thing, but nothing augurs in as strongly or better than physical presence in the marketplace. When property owners, particularly active property sellers, when dormant property owners have become active, if they're driving past your signs, that's an immediate draw card. And we can stimulate this even further, especially with those active property sellers. And I do need to actually get this point across, even though I may have put this out there in the past before. And that is that, the reality is that you are chasing active property sellers. And the reason I'm actually bringing this up is, again, I was reminded of this when somebody was talking to me about leads. Leads in terms of prospecting to me is a horrific word, because you can have a lot of leads that kind of lead to nowhere, especially if that lead is one where the person is not looking in any way, shape or form of making their move imminently. By imminently, I mean within the next 12 weeks, within the next 3 months. So, I've openly said, as we talked about when we're looking or examining sales inquiry, that the research phase takes from about 4 to 12 weeks. So if someone's projecting that they're looking at making the move and they've started their research and they're running up to as long as 12 weeks, well, they're selling imminently. They're active property sellers. They're the ones we're chasing. Do not stress yourself out about, whether or not you're coming into contact with property owners that are housed in your area. I'm not saying don't collect the data. I'm not saying don't meet them if the opportunity arises. And I'm not saying don't then put them into your database where they're receiving information from you. But this should not be your primary consideration. What you should be looking at to create prospect flow is, how do I draw the attention? How do I make the connection? How do I identify active property sellers as early as I can? And then how do I underpin that with all of the offerings that you have inside of your professional capacity that are going to weigh in once that decision to actually put the property on the market is made and you fit in there quite nicely. Now, when I talk to most sales professionals, and there are some on here now that are listening, and I say to them, when you list a property, what's the first consideration? What's the first thought that comes to mind? Now, in the capacity of a salesperson, they'll almost immediately say, well, selling it. And I'll say, and then what? And I'll say, well, once we've actually sold it, well, then I want more listings, and provided I do a great job with this one, that will then entitle me to leverage off that and move into other listings. Now, I'm not saying don't do that. I'm saying that's precisely the concept that we're looking at gleaning here. But I find that most salespeople tend to look at leverage after having successfully sold the property rather. So, if I put that into words, that means that they're leveraging off the back end of a listing once it's sold. But I prefer to look at it as leverage from the moment I get hold of it. So I leverage off the front end, I leverage during the listing, and I leverage off the back end. My entire mode of operation is to create prospect flow. And if I look at the phase of traction, it is purely about turning one listing into two, turning those two into four, thereby building market share. I don't want to rest on my laurels until I've got a 30% market share. And at a 30% market share of any definitive geographic area is a space where they'll then move into momentum. To be honest with you, this is largely dealt with in at the real estate rockstar level. I don't find that many agents are at the stage where they've built up their market share to about a third of the market, which is the optimum level. And until such time as you get to that, I'm not saying that you don't engage in momentum protocols, but you shouldn't be looking to rest and just retain market share until you get there. And it's a very simple analogy. See, once you've actually got seed listings, once you've won listings, and you are immediately, as we've talked about before, initiating the big three. The first, of course, being sales inquiry. Now that you have a listing, it's going to generate sales inquiry, whether it be for the for sale sign, whether it be from people attending the open for inspections or the welcome homes, as we call them. And that means that you've got a voice in the marketplace. And I openly articulate this to agents. So if you're in the sales associate capacity, if you're starting out, if you're a sales professional that's looking to build market share or rejuvenate your market, understand this. Every time you have a listing, this creates a voice in the marketplace. So long as the right message emanates from that listing to any other incumbent sellers, any active property sellers researching the market ahead of putting theirs on, you're going to win their favor. So one listing leads to two, those two lead to four, and you can readily build market share. And the best way I articulate this is to say that once you've got listings and you've got them operating functionally well inside the marketplace, you don't really have to look for sellers because they're already watching you. Your next listing is paying attention to you. Now, the analogy I use around this, which precedes the regenerative prospecting process, is I say, look, where should you be looking for sellers? Now, there's lots of traditional or theoretical modes that are quite archaic, in my opinion, that say that if you're looking at a geographic area of 1,000 houses, which coincidentally is not enough, its max capacity is about 20 properties it can deliver upon. And if you're looking at those 1,000 houses and you steadfastly go out there and meet all of those people in the marketplace. Now, if you're working, let's say 200 days per annum, might be 250 days if you're a lunatic and you're wanting to work too many hours or whatever, and you're working a couple of 100 to 250 days, and you've got an area of 1,000, and you decide to go out and meet as many of those people on a one-on-one basis, invariably you're going to come into contact with sellers and you're going to make listings and sales. But again, that's going to be limited by your capacity to go out and meet them, especially if you're meeting someone now that you intend to do business with long term. Now, from my perspective, and I started this whole series by explaining this to you, why would you want to go and do hand-to-hand combat, meeting one person at a time, especially when the vast majority of those aren't doing anything inside of a market? And let's face it, if you've got an area of 1,000 properties, not all those people are going to be selling this year, especially when its capacity to deliver to you personally is only around 20. If you understand marketing, and that's how you can communicate with that whole volume of people en masse more readily, you can increase the size of that geographic precinct. So let's blow that out to 3,000, and we utilize marketing to communicate with them. Now, it's a simple analogy. So what I am constantly saying to myself, the same as I rolled out in the week before last, I'm sorry, when I talked about sales inquiry and how it works, we reverse engineered the process that active property sellers go through. Now, I've already said they're watching you. So what we have to work out is this, and it's probably the best analogy I can give you. I call this the nightclub theory. If you wanted to meet a partner, I want you to take yourselves all the way back to the point that you're young and single. For some of us, this is just a distant memory, but it just, I believe, illustrates the point fairly readily. So I want you to imagine you're in your late teens, early 20s, and all of a sudden you have this desire to meet someone around your age because that's just the condition. You want to meet a partner. And I give you a choice. You can go to a local nightclub where obviously other people of the same age and persuasion are going to be gathering, or we can go to a function at a retirement village that your grandparents are part of or otherwise, in the hope of bumping someone's niece, nephew, or otherwise. Which of the two would you choose? Now, of course, if you leave the sick part out of it, the natural choice is to go to a nightclub because the probability of you meeting someone dramatically increases. Now, when I look at traditional prospecting methods, this hand-to-hand combat, I liken that to going to the retirement village function and just hopefully striking someone. Whereas if we look at going to the nightclub, and the probability dramatically increases because there's likely to be a whole lot of people that are there for the same reasons that you are and wanting to connect. So when we look at prospecting, the first question I always have in my mind is, where do active property sellers gather? If I know for a fact that my next incumbent seller is most likely watching that listing or sign that I have, and if I want to control that message that gets directly to them, I can also control the fact that I'm getting a message to the active property seller independent of the dormant property owner. So the question I say is, where are the active property seller nightclubs, metaphorically speaking, of course? Well, to my mind, they emanate, or the epicenter of those is a for sale sign. So the next question, of course, is, what is the radius? Now, if I work on the theory that people sell once every 10 years, I can safely say that every time I have a listing within a definitive radius of about 50 properties, there are likely to be anything up to 5 people that are looking on stats at making a move this year. So it means I'm going to come into contact with people, and I've every chance of leveraging off of that sign, hopefully, at the very least, of a replacement value 1-to-1, with a strong chance of getting up to as many as 3. Now, if I only get 1, that's fine. If I get 1.5 for every listing that I've got, that's ideal. And if I get 3, that's just astounding. But what I'm looking to do is understand how I can create those opportunities to identify. And we went through this last week. In the first instance, I want to identify that seller. I don't want to panic because they may only still be in the early stages of researching the market ahead of selling. So once I've identified them, all I then want to move to is presenting them with my product and its value proposition. I then want to offer advice, not price. So I'm presenting my product, offering advice, not price, giving with no condition of receiving back. And I'm creating a disposition where most of my activity is directly engaging what I call active property sellers, or DAPs, direct active property seller engagement. That to me is the key to actually winning listings. So we call this the regenerative prospecting process. And in doing it, we examine some of the things that we see other agents do traditionally that actually represents the wrong message. Now, some of you might be familiar with this, some of you may not. But one of the real big key components that agents just can't wait to promote out there is the fact that they've just listed a property. But they do this in a fashion that's really benign in terms of prospecting. They also do this with properties that are sold. When a property is sold, they can't wait to promote the fact that it's sold, and they do that in an incorrect fashion. Now, I'm going to just alert you to something that I learned a long time ago, and I believe this maxim is true in the real estate space. They say that women don't necessarily dress for the opposite sex, men. They don't wear all these fashionable clothes. They don't get engaged in fashion necessarily to attract men. They say that, generally speaking, women dress for other women. So they like to complement and compare with each other. Now, I don't know whether that's true, but it led me to believe this next point, which I know for a fact is true. I find that agents don't market effectively for sellers. They say that they do, and they want to attract the attention of other sellers, but it seems to me that their marketing most of the time is typically centric to other agents. They like to boast about what happened. You know, when they get a listing, they can't wait to get the just listed out because they want the competition to know that they got it. And they do this in such a fashion that kind of precludes winning the favor of another listing. I'll explain what I mean. So they list a property, the for sale sign goes up. Now, if you were an active property seller and you're in that definitive radius of 50 properties and you see a for sale sign go up on a property, do you say to yourself, I should wait for the just listed correspondence to come out so I know which agent to contact to ask questions about it? Or, wanting to know what it's on the market for, do you immediately go online and see if it's already advertised? Or then maybe ring the agency if you can't find it advertised, ring the agency, posing as a buyer and asking questions from the sign. And if you get that information, if the just listed then turns up, is it not benign? Worse, can it make your agency look relatively incompetent? Of course it can. I mean, you know, as my father used to say to me, there's no point in advertising sold stock. And that kind of makes sense. So if you're trying to get active property sellers to call you and you have some information on a property you've just listed, why would you advertise that where they can then go and get that information independent of talking to you? So it is, we have, which is available to you, a just listed, we call this LA Woman, and I'll give more information on each of these protocols, each of these steps as we go. We call it LA Woman because we want you to leave it by the doors. If some of you don't know what that means, it means that you were probably born this millennium and are unaware of the fact that there was a band called The Doors many years ago. And one of the songs they sung was LA Woman. That's why we gave it the title. Now, on LA Woman, we make sure that you deliver this before the for sale sign goes up. So there's no sign to be seen. The leaflet itself has no photograph of the property, mentions the street, but not the specific number. So it says just listed in your neighborhood. We just listed a property on Jones Street and wanted the neighbors to be the first to know. If, like Mr. and Mrs. Johnson picture below, you're researching the market ahead of selling and would like some information on this or any of our other pre-release listings, give us a call at this number and a call directly to you. Now, if that information is given out and an active property seller gets hold of that, there's no sign on the property, no other information, that to them is irresistible. They want to know because they're running comparisons. So they will call you direct. Their first question will be, where is it? And how much is it? But this is an easy way for you to identify, and all you've done is send information out in the right manner. And here's the important thing, in the right sequence. So we've set that just listed out. That's given us every chance of connecting with any active property seller in that area, identifying, don't panic, don't then get all gooey and try and get to the salesperson down there. Don't start talking about, we'll give you an idea on price, just identify. And once, if they say, yeah, we are actually looking at moving, the next line should not be, do you want me to send someone down? The next line should be, where are you moving to and how soon do you need to be there? So that's one opportunity, which is part of the regen. The second opportunity that we have is to do what we call a two-view website. This is an individual property website that utilizes the street address of that particular property. We get that up and away. We give that to the seller. The seller then distributes it to their social network, where do most of their friends live locally. They're seeing this. They then run inquiries back, and any sellers can then ring up and say, well, where's it going and what's happening around it? Second chance. Third point, we now put this for sale sign up. Now that the for sale sign has gone up, we then know that we have the next open for inspection occurring. So the next thing is to send an invitation out to the welcome home. And the wording on this is imperative. It should say, welcome home, here's the time and date, and it should say, you're invited. We've just listed a nearby property and wanted the neighbors to be the first to know. If you're researching the market ahead of selling, we want you to feel welcome to come out and check this out in comparison to yours. And while you're there, don't forget to ask our representative for your copy of the property seller's research guide. All of this is irresistible to a seller. First of all, they're being directly invited. They can feel comfortable that they're coming to check that open for inspection out without the need for indicating that they're looking at buying. They don't need to feel like a buyer. They may well turn up and ask for that property seller's research guide. Bang, you've got identification. Then, of course, we've got the follow-up. That's something else I'll share with you that we can run in. Then, of course, we move to meeting them at the open for inspection. Then we've got the follow-up on the backside of the open for inspection. And then, of course, when it sells. Now, when it sells, I find that salespeople just trip over themselves to actually get this news out. In fact, they can't wait to put the for sale sign up. If you're supporting a salesperson, please get them on side with this and refrain from doing that. One of the first things I say to a seller once we've got the property sold and it's gone unconditional is that there's no problem. I congratulate them and I just say to them, I just want you to know that we're going to refrain from putting the sold sticker on for the next couple of days. Is that okay? There's nothing wrong. The deal is done. But this is our opportunity to market to any other sellers that are in the area, capture their imagination and maybe get them on the market. Because it's at that point, if you don't put the sold sticker up, you can still put information out about the property having sold, and those active property sellers will want to know, what did it sell for? And they'll contact you. If you put the sold sticker on at the moment that it happens, they may ring the agency or try to glean that information independent of talking to you. So it's clearly understood that leverage is the important thing. And then, of course, there are other things that you want to seek. You want to get an accolade from the property that's just been sold. We want to get that accolade and get that out into the marketplace. This in turn creates regeneration of listings and things as they occur. There's more to this. We will run that out. The message that's most important here is this. You have to understand that the moment a property is listed, especially if you're supporting a salesperson, that you need to swing into action, leveraging protocols that will bring listings in. Secondly, you have to make sure that that message is conducive to them seeing the value inside your product and how that actually works. So of course they come to that welcome home, and last week we talked about that being a virtual listing presentation. So you can see with the big three generators, they're intertwined, they're interlocked to each other. You've got a sign that creates inquiry. The inquiry can come from the welcome home, which is the second part, and the welcome home sits nicely inside of a whole series of steps. Know that in the regenerative prospecting process, there are at least 10 steps. And if you utilize those leveraging points every step of the way, if you are very focused on collating the sales inquiry, building that in so that you can then go and harvest and run those protocols. If you're running open homes as virtual listing presentations and that right message is emanating from them to any incumbent sellers, and then finally, if you're running those 10 steps, these are the only things that you need to do to have absolute prospect flow. Anything you haven't been clear on or you need to understand, feel free, as I said, to drop those questions in, or you can email me, Mark with a K @propertycareers.com.au, or you can contact me +61 410 592 165. Thank you very much for listening.